it's almost like a reverse hangover with psychedelics because the experience itself is really tricky, but then you get the benefits after. And sometimes 6 months after a journey, I still get insights from what happened during that week.
Welcome to Breaking Stereotypes with Todd and Tootsie. Today we are joined by Julia Blum, who used plant medicine to overcome depression and an eating disorder. Now, Julia advocates for using psychedelics for healing on her TikTok channel, Find Jules. But before we get started with Julia, I'd just like to ask our viewers to like this video and subscribe to our channel, as it will help the YouTube algorithm and help our new channel to grow.
Welcome, Julia.
Hi, Todd. Hi, Tootsie.
So
Thank
let's
you so
start.
much for having me.
Yeah, of course, of course. Thanks for coming on. So let's start with what do you think the stereotypes are of psychedelics in general and the people that use them?
I think one of the biggest stereotypes for psychedelics probably is the hippie.
Hmm.
And I think that just comes from, the 60s, 70s culture and people who are maybe, slacking a little bit in life and just escape to this experience rather than, participating in society. I think that's certainly one. I think drugs more broadly have different types of stereotypes too, right? I think before I knew a lot about psychedelics, if I had heard the word LSD and someone using LSD, I would have, thought of a drug addict, to be quite frank.
Hmm.
So previous to your using them, you actually believed in some of those stereotypes yourself?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, it wasn't until I came to the US, I would say that that changed a little bit because I grew up in Europe and the drug stigma is, I would say, even stronger in Europe. And also, drug use is less common. So I didn't have, anyone in my immediate environment taking drugs. So it felt like this foreign other thing that we just don't do, right? And then I came into the US and I realized drugs are actually much more part of mainstream culture here than they are in Europe. So that opened it up a little bit for me.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about how you discovered psychedelics as plant medicine and what was going on that led you there?
Yeah, sure. So when I discovered psychedelics, I was at a place in my life where everything was truly perfect on paper. I was at business school, my employer had paid for school, I was living in New York, living the life. Everything on the outside was fantastic, but on the inside, things were really going downhill. I'd struggled with an eating disorder for many years that I struggled to overcome despite, many efforts. And I also increasingly struggled with depression. And the situation just became more serious in spite of all the therapeutic help that I was getting. I'd seen multiple therapists, I'd seen psychiatrists, et cetera, and everyone was urging me to go on medication. And I just deep down believed that there must be a better way to get to the root cause of things. And then I read Michael Pollan's book, which I'm sure a lot of the people that got into psychedelics now and my generation, that's how they found their way to it. And it really opened up my interest and I became very fascinated very quickly.
And so you told us previously that you were actually a risk averse person. So how did you overcome any of the sort of anxiety or nerves you would have in trying something so new and different like that?
I think there's probably two components. One was just education. I educated myself on the topic for, I think, almost an entire year before touching a single psychedelic. So I read, all the different books, I read some of the research, I watched some of the documentaries. And then the second thing is just how I approached it. I made sure, based on all that I'd learned, that I would create these settings for myself that would be as safe as possible, given, I wouldn't be able to do it in a clinical setting. So I think through that, I felt pretty good about it. And then with ayahuasca specifically, which I think was probably the more frightening of the things that I tried, it truly was that I woke up one day and I felt so miserable that I thought whatever is going to happen at that ayahuasca retreat, it can't get any worse. So I think also, the desperation played in where I'm already feeling so terrible. It can't, can't get much worse than this. I might as well try.
Hmm. So can you tell us about that first ayahuasca experience?
Yeah, sure. So for the first experience, it was very important for me to have a very safe, legal, and medical setting as much as possible. So I went to a retreat in Costa Rica. And as I said, I woke up one day, 3 weeks later, I was there, and there was like a little bit of nervousness, but I no longer feared. I knew in my bones that I was meant to do this experience. And it to date was probably one of the most profound weeks of my life. So it was a week-long retreat, and you have 4 ayahuasca ceremonies in a row, pretty much, with some breath work before and after. And it was definitely the most challenging week, too, but in a good way. And I came out of it and returned to my life, not as the same person. Like a lot of things had internally shifted for me. So I'm happy to go into the specifics of what happened during that first retreat, if that's of interest. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So essentially, during the first retreat, the first few nights, I did not feel the medicine. So everyone, when speaking about ayahuasca, everyone calls it the medicine. So I didn't feel it. And it's not uncommon to not feel it the first time, but the second and the third time. And the shamans say that the medicine needs time to get to know you. And the way this medicine works is that you drink it and then it scans your soul and it heals by priority. So by scanning your body and your soul and your mind, it tries to find the thing in you that has the most emotional charge. So that can bring up specifically that thing in service of your overall healing, right? So you go in always with intentions, but in the end, with ayahuasca specifically, the medicine will give you what you need, whether that was aligned with your intention or not. Often it is, sometimes it's not, right? And my intention for the retreat was really to help me overcome my eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And by the third night, the fact that I didn't feel anything really, got to my core. It really upset me. I'd had some stomach cramps the 2 nights before, which I didn't at all connect to the ayahuasca. I thought it was just stomach cramps, and they returned, and everyone around me was having these healing exorcisms on ayahuasca. There's very prominently a purge involved, which can include throwing up, but also often it's crying and other things. And I just didn't feel anything. And I was lying there, and these thoughts of like, why me? Why me kept coming up. Like, am I too broken to fix? Like, why can't I get this healing that everyone else is getting, right? And this just intensifies. And eventually I started crying a little bit. At that point, I still thought it was about the fact that I didn't feel the ayahuasca, right? In the meantime, I had these really intense stomach cramps. And then at some point it shifted, and I realized I was no longer the 27-year-old woman, but maybe the 6, 7, or 8-year-old girl that had just been punched in the stomach. And that was why her stomach was hurting so much. And the tears just poured out of me. I couldn't control it at all. I became very loud. So they put me outside so my crying wouldn't disturb everyone. And it was just a really painful experience. And it went on for hours. Eventually, the shaman came outside and sat down to help me process what was happening. And one of the questions that she asked me was, you know, she asked me specifically about the event and to what degree, I remember how it impacted me. And then she asked me what I took away from it. And it became obvious in that moment that the belief that I took away from it was that something was not right with me, that, I was broken. Otherwise, I wouldn't deserve being treated that way. And that's what children unfortunately do, right? They never blame the caretaker in their own protection. They blame themselves. And she told me, when you're ready, you'll be able to let go and forgive, and you can ask the medicine for help. And I kept thinking, how could I possibly forgive someone who beats an innocent child, right? But she went away, and I was crying a little bit more. And then eventually I whispered out loud, please help me forgive. I felt really weird doing that, but I thought, I might as well try. Mm-hmm. And what followed was probably the most mystical minute of my life. And most of my ayahuasca experiences have been very grounded in reality, just emotionally experienced, not so much hallucinogenic. And that minute was very, visionary. So the wind turned me around, and I was looking at the stars above me. And I was so exhausted. So I just decided to take a really long and deep breath in. And with that one breath in, it felt like I was inhaling love straight from the stars above me, aka the universe, into my own heart. And it filled up my heart. And the realization that followed was, wow, where that came from, that's, expanding, that's abundant, because I'm very into astrophysics. So I know like the properties of the universe, right? So I realized, oh, that love is, endless. And I walked home and I just wrote down one thing in my phone, and that was, love is the fabric of the universe. And I went to sleep. And my life really has not been the same since. And yeah, I returned to my life that was carefully crafted by someone who didn't feel enough, and suddenly I felt enough. So that was very hard. The integration of the whole process took me over a year, but yeah.
Well, it's an amazing story, and there's a lot to unpack with it. And I definitely want to get to integration, but I think before that, I just want to understand, like, how different was that feeling versus any other kind of therapy or drug or any other thing that you tried before?
At that point, I'd only had one LSD experience and one or two mushroom experiences. So I encountered ayahuasca quite early, and it was pretty different. I have to say, just because it felt so much more targeted. And I think, the message that I always receive from psychedelics is always this universal love and acceptance, like you're perfect as you are, right? And I think that's what the mushrooms teach me. Whenever I journey with mushrooms, always this comes up, right? But with ayahuasca, it was just very specific. Ayahuasca to me felt like a doctor. Like she knew what was wrong with me. She went into the wound, she brought it up, helped me process it, and then she filled me back up, right? So it's extremely unique, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Julia, one of the services that you offer is you consult with people regarding plant medicine and, kind of how to use that responsibly and so on and so forth. And you and I did that, had that consultation. And I tried the mushrooms, and I didn't go all the way. You had given me a specific dose because I was a little anxious about having a bad trip, to be honest with you. So I
Mhm.
went about halfway, but it was an unexpected, profound experience for me. So the first thing that happened was, as soon as I ingested them, I just said to myself, this is going to be a healing experience. I just kept saying that over and over, just because I was scared to have a bad trip. Like I was saying, no matter what happens, this is going to be healing. And after a while, I just started scrolling on YouTube, and I found this channel where it was a teenage girl who was reacting to different movies of the era in which Tootsie and I grew up in. So the first reaction she was reacting to Top Gun. Okay, so that was one of my favorite movies as a kid growing up. And I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but one of the pilots, Iario, dies at one point, and she started crying over it. But the what ended up happening for me was that I had this realization that I had always wanted to have a daughter, and I had never had a daughter. And because of that, I had this thought saying, if you let that go, you'll be okay. But you have to let it go, because if you don't, you're never going to be okay. And then I was just able to enjoy watching her react to these videos, and I watched like 4 of them in a row, and I just had this really positive feeling. Like it wasn't a feeling of loss. It was something that I really felt like she had all the properties I was looking for in a daughter, and she was experiencing these movies that I had watched as a kid, and it was something that just was really healing. But the message, and it wasn't something I could control. I just had thoughts that kept saying, you have to let this go. And then you'll be okay. And so I don't know if that's typical of an experience like that, but I didn't search for this girl. I just stumbled upon her, and my thought process is that, that maybe that's one of the things that I've been yearning for, or traumas that I've had. And because of the fact that I had connected with her, because she looked she looks like a very, young version of myself, that then it connected to that part of myself. And then the kind of mushrooms connected to my brain as far as saying, this is something you need to work on. I never would have got that through therapy, though.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm getting chills over here. I'm so happy that it was a healing experience for you. I'm really happy to hear that. I'm also not surprised to hear anything what you're saying, because the one theme that is consistent across psychedelic journeys, and they are so different from each other for each person, for each substance, but it's always about letting go. It's always about letting go. And in that, we find freedom, right? Because that, feeling of, I don't know if it was resentment or grief or sadness or whatever it was surrounding that, lack of a daughter that you had, that was weighing you down, right? And in that moment, the mushrooms help you understand that it's okay to let those feelings go and be okay without it, right? And that's how people find freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the most important part of that equation is that, again, I don't think that's something I would have ever come to the conclusion of, like through a regular therapy session or just within myself. I needed to watch that video and have the mushrooms. The combination of the two then said, wow, that's something that, I've always wanted, but I've never had. And, it made me sad without knowing it.
Yeah. And psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. So they work with whatever situation that you're in, right? If you'd sat there and for some reason you would have watched another video that might have, have some other connection to your psyche, the psychedelics would have found what that other thing is in your subconscious that is, necessary to bring up.
And what it sounds like in his case, in your case, and in probably most cases, these are things that are deeply buried. And so we had asked you, do psychedelics speed up the healing process? And you said no, because this is stuff that you never would have gotten to normally. Can you kind of explain that?
Yeah, totally. Well, I had this eating disorder and this depression, and I had been in therapy for 5 years. So I really felt like I knew that my insides. I really knew why I was doing the things that I was doing, which didn't help me, change anything about the behavior ultimately. And healing with psychedelics is ultimately about awareness. That's the one thing that's the one other thing next to letting go that's common across, people's journeys, is that just by bringing stuff into your awareness, it can create a healing experience. And sometimes it's just that. Other times it requires more, right? I've had experiences where just making the subconscious conscious was the healing experiences. And then I had, journeys where it brought up a subconscious belief, and unpacking that belief took me months to work through it, right? But these things are so deeply buried within us because, our psyche is savvy. I think the mind is really perfect in the way it protects us. And I work a lot with internal family systems therapy, which believes in the multiplicity of the mind, where we have a few different groups of parts inside everyone's personality. And they're the managing parts, and they're the more vulnerable parts, which are often exiled because they were shamed in childhood or something like that. And the managers are what dominate, our conversations and our thoughts every single day. It's the people pleasers, the overachievers, the planners, the anxious mind, right? Those are all managing for us. And what happens during the psychedelic journey is that it dials down the volume on the managers and invites them to step back to make space for these voices that they so wildly protect, right? Which they do in our favor. Like all these parts in our mind, they all have good intentions. They just want to protect us, right? But that's, and sometimes, oftentimes talk therapy can't get you. There are other things to venture into the subconscious, but I would say that psychedelics are by far the most effective and fastest and efficient way to do that.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics as far as, at one point there was a lot of experimentation with talk therapy in the 60s and early 70s, I believe. And then, that kind of disappeared, and now it's potentially reemerging, or it should be anyways.
Yeah, there were a few different waves, and the first wave was really when Albert Hoffman first synthesized LSD. And that changed everything because up until that date, psychologists had been starting to use mescaline, which is very hard to scale because you need a lot. It's not very potent. And then LSD, it's the opposite. Just a tiny drop is, I don't know, 1,000 trips, right? And that changed the game. And it was all, it originated from pharma, right? It was, Hoffman was working for Sandoz when he discovered LSD. So Sandoz started sending this out to psychiatrists, inviting them to research with it. And that's what really kickstarted everything. And then psilocybin, aka magic mushrooms, came onto the stage, and Tim Leary and Richard Alpert started the psilocybin Harvard Mushroom Project, which was later shut down and became a very controversial thing. But there was a period in time where research was flourishing. And it was widely recognized by everyone that psychedelics are the new era for psychiatry. And then everything got shut down, not because it was harmful for people, but because the government had ulterior motives, which decades later, a Nixon advisor admitted publicly that the reason they started the war on drugs was to criminate the administration's main enemies, which were the anti-war left and the blacks, right? Which they did with cannabis and psychedelics. So everything was put into Schedule 1, which from one day to the other completely stopped all research. And the research was really, really promising, right? And then so some people, still continue doing this underground, and MDMA, which is not a classical psychedelic, but I think in the broader context of what's going to happen in the next few years, very relevant. MDMA came into the picture a few years later, I think in the late 80s. And people started using MDMA as a therapy drug way before it became a rave drug, right? They were using it for couples therapy, etc. And then MDMA also became scheduled. And there was this one guy who in college decided, I'm going to be a psychedelic therapist. And then, all the regulation hit, and he realized that's no longer a great goal because it's illegal. So my new goal is to make psychedelics legal again. And that's Rick Doblin. And he's the one who's spearheading the entire movement with MAPS, which is the organization that's going to have the first likely FDA approved psychedelic therapy in 2023 or 2024. Mm-hmm. And he's been doing this research for 3 decades. And finally now it's picking up. The stigma is slowly, crumbling, and there's more and more research. All these institutions across the globe are building psychedelic research centers. Berkeley just opened one. There's one, at NYU. Johns Hopkins is doing a lot of research with mushrooms. So it's really, really exciting because the prohibition is going to come to an end, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happens, what do you see it looking like? I mean, would it be to a point where there are dispensaries just like it is with weed? Is that kind of where it's headed, do you think?
That's a really good question. And that's one that's fiercely discussed right now because there are 2 different ways to bring psychedelics to the world, right? There's the medical model where this will be clinical treatments for people with diagnoses such as PTSD, major depression, etc. And then there is the legalized nature movement, which wants to make mushrooms and other plant medicines, primarily they're advocating for plant medicines, entirely available to everyone. And that is connected to sort of the community model where you might have retreats that anyone can join and you don't need to have a diagnosis, right? And I'm personally biased a little bit because while the first one is probably safer and more controlled, it leaves out a lot of people because I don't think psychedelics is just for the mentally ill, right? Mm-hmm. I have friends that didn't have any mental illness and they've benefited from psychedelic use tremendously. It makes you more connected to yourself and those around you. It makes you more creative. It just, honestly, in my opinion, it makes you a better human. So I don't think it should be limited to those that have the diagnosis. Plus the diagnosis, that's going to take the FDA process, which will take years for all these different, diagnoses. And psychedelics are not just for PTSD or addiction. They're transdiagnostics. They can pretty much work with whatever you bring, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a fierce debate. Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk about integration because, you have this super profound experience on a retreat and then you have to go back to your old life. And, in many cases, it may completely not align with what you just felt or discovered. And in addition to that, you have to kind of process and try to change yourself in some way. So, for example, Todd has this experience. He has to let go of this idea of having a daughter. So how does somebody integrate something like that and also kind of manage their normal life?
Yeah, I love that you're asking this because I'm very passionate about integration because it's what makes all the difference. Otherwise, you just escape into this different world, right? What do we do with it? And for me, there was the personal insights and the transpersonal. So on a personal level, the realization that I was in fact enough and I was in fact not broken, but I'd always been whole. I just felt the way I felt for a very good reason. Like it was so affirming to realize that I always felt broken all my life. I felt like something was wrong with me. And I finally learned why. That was such a huge relief. So that was on a personal note, something to bring into my life, right? Which I alluded to earlier. That was very difficult because my whole life was carefully crafted by someone who thrived on external validation. I had this high paying job. I had a closet with all these expensive clothes. And it just like I came to that world and it didn't feel like mine anymore. So I had to make a lot of difficult choices, including leaving the city where all my friends lived. I just felt like New York was no longer, sustainable for me. I'm a very quiet person in reality. And changing my job ultimately, and all these things, which were like big, hard decisions to make. On a transpersonal note, I had realized that love was the fabric of the universe. I mean, that changed everything for me. And my spiritual journey began already before psychedelics, but I pretty much been an atheist for the majority of my life. And then I began getting into yoga and meditation and I got curious, but it didn't yet change my mind. But then ayahuasca confirmed to me that there was something bigger. And I think that integrating that into your daily life is also not a small feat. Because if it's true that the underlying quality of everything in this universe is love, what does that mean for how I treat myself and how I treat the people around me, right? Because that's the experience I always get in psychedelics is this experience of unconditional love. And, you know, how can I bring that into my life so that I radiate this love to myself and the people around me so that I don't need to return to psychedelics to feel it because I have it in my everyday, right? And that's also something that was pretty new to me, to be honest.
So, do you remember the feeling that you had when you had these experiences, or does it fade over time? And because of that, is that what draws people back to it?
I can tap into it any moment in time. I close my eyes and I just see myself lying there and I feel it in my heart and it feels like my heart is exploding, which I think is part of the reason why psychedelics are such viable, sustainable long-term treatments because you do it once, specifically with ayahuasca, and the benefits, for some people, it's the rest of their lives. Some people might have to do more than one retreat, right? I'm not saying that it's a miracle cure, but it's almost like a reverse hangover with psychedelics because the experience itself is really tricky, but then you get the benefits after. And sometimes 6 months after a journey, I still get insights from what happened during that week.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Reverse hangover is a great
Yeah.
description.
Absolutely. What's your experience been as far as, so if you have great insights that you gain and then, that's, you kind of integrate that into your life. Then when you go back, are you gaining more insights or like, how does that work versus, or is it just healing to some of the insights that you have already become aware of?
I think it's both. I think I went through this phase where I was extremely targeted with what I wanted to get out of it, right? Like my mission was to solve my eating disorder and my depression. And that's what I always went in with in some, variation. And then I also had other journeys outside of the ayahuasca experiences that were, I would say, more flexible, where, for example, instead of, going out and partying on New Year's Eve, I had a mushroom ceremony with two of my closest girlfriends. And we were setting intentions, what we want to experience tonight and for the new year. And we had a beautiful experience. So I don't think it always has to be, I need to solve this specific problem. I think it's a much wider realm.
Mhm.
But I also try to not do it too often, right? Because I don't want to jump from one experience into the other. So a few experiences a year is more than enough for me and gives me more than enough to integrate usually.
Mhm.
So, how do people find a reliable shaman these days? Because as it becomes,
These days?
yeah, you just Yelp it. I mean, but seriously, as it becomes more popular, I imagine,
Sure.
there's going to be a lot of people out there that might not be legitimate. And so,
Yeah.
how do people navigate finding a good one?
It's a huge problem. And it's a problem that everyone in this space is very aware of because, especially the sexual abuse allegations, just keep piling up from everywhere. Even in the MAPS, MDMA, FDA controlled trials, there are allegations of sexual abuse, right? Because you put yourself in such a vulnerable state. If you're not with the right person in the right container, that's really, really harmful, right? So obviously, it's still illegal mostly in the US. There are some places that have already decriminalized specific plant medicines, mostly mushrooms, some places in California, Colorado, et cetera. You can pretty much Google the list. And I've actually seen that people have started openly selling in dispensaries in these places. But I always say to people who are new to this, I don't recommend you just go out there, buy something, and have it yourself. I would always do it with ideally a guide, but I realize that's sometimes hard to find. So at the minimum, a trip sitter, someone, who is educated on how to handle these journeys and watching over someone in those journeys, which is the education for that is like there's lots of online resources, 1 hour workshop on how to trip sit, and that can be more than enough, right?
Mhm.
So I think for people, it's a process where the first thing you should ask yourself is like, what do you want to get out of it? And based off of that, what are the substances that you feel drawn towards that you think might help you with that? And then based on the substance, where is the best place to do that? So for ayahuasca, it's really good to go to Peru or Costa Rica, where it's completely legal, right? There are also ayahuasca churches in the US that operate legally. But I always tend to believe that it's better to keep those communities to the people who, have belonged to those communities for a very long time. So I think if you can afford to travel, I always recommend people to travel. For mushrooms, if you want a completely legal experience, you can fly to Jamaica. There's a few retreats there. I think there are retreats in Mexico, and you can also, if you're in Europe, go to Amsterdam, right, where it's completely legal. So there are some workarounds. If you're not in a position where you can afford any of these retreats, which I'm going to admit are quite pricey, I would say the best place to start is most bigger cities usually have a psychedelic society. I know New York has one, and there are some like online communities. And I would just start, talking to those people in those communities because likely a lot of those people, will have had experiences and that's why they ended up in those communities. And then you ask those for more. But maybe in terms of like when you're looking for a guide specifically, there are a few red flags that I really urge people to look out for. Number one is, do they welcome all your questions? Because you should ask all the questions you want. You should ask a ton of questions. And if they ever make you feel like weird for asking so many questions, it's not your person, right? It's a
Mhm.
completely new treatment modality. They need to explain it to you if you don't know it. Secondly, is the spiritual superiority. Do you sense like a big ego, like I'm this healer? I hate even when people use the word healer because psychedelics reveal is that's not someone else. Even a
Mhm.
shaman is not a healer, right? The shaman creates an environment in which you can access your own healing intelligence. That's the shaman's job. And he does so by communicating with the plant and helping translate the teachings from the plant to you if you need help with that. But the healers are is ourselves, right? And the plants can help us, activate that inner healing intelligence. So the spiritual superiority is something to watch out for. Like, are they walking around promising you miracles? If anyone uses the miracle language, I would shy away from that. Like, I can fix your depression in one night. Definitely not, right?
Mhm.
To what extent they, wear the power of the plants as their own and they make you feel like the insights that you're getting or that other people are getting from their guidance is a function of their facilitation rather than a function of the plants. Like all these things, I would just watch out for and just trust your gut, because I think with these things, your gut will really be able to tell us whether it's someone. You should always connect with them before and ask them how much experience they have, not only with the medicine, but with facilitating the medicine for other people. That's critical too.
I would say for me, in my experience, you were very helpful to me because we had our conversation. You asked a lot of questions, and that was something that was extremely valuable because going into the experience, I kind of sort of knew what to expect. Obviously, I didn't, know where I would land, but at the same time, it's something that just having that consultation gave me the confidence to be able to do that. And then, you had said, you asked me like what's your most comfortable spot and things of that nature. And so, for me, it's my home with the fire on. And I had, my dog was my shaman. And, he was curled up next to me. And then I just kind of, again, kind of took your advice as far as saying that this will be something that will really be healing. But to have that mantra over and over again, and then it just occurred naturally. But it was something that, again, it kind of gave me that, because I had never had any experiences with any psychedelics ever prior, but talking with you, you were just so caring and soothing, and just gave me this just knowledge that everything was going to be okay. And that's the way it worked. So
thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it.
well, it's the truth. And it's something that's, again, I think that, people like yourself provide a really valuable service for people. And I hope for 1 second you don't underestimate the power that you have, because it's huge.
I do want to ask about bad trips, because I think that's probably the biggest anxiety that people have going in, right? Todd talked about it himself. Mm-hmm. Like, so he had this kind of mantra, like hoping that would, make sure it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So can you speak to bad trips and, what people can do to maybe mitigate that, and how common are they, and how bad can they be?
Mm-hmm. So I always say I don't believe there's such a thing as a bad trip. And whenever I say it on TikTok, the people come after me because everyone comes, wait, but I had a bad trip, right? Uh-huh. And what I mean when I say that is I don't believe in bad trips, but I do believe in challenging trips, and they are pretty common, right? Because these are healing experiences, and healing is not always fun. In fact, most of the times it's not fun, it's painful. And so why I want to get away from this phrasing of the bad trip is because when I hear it, I think of this narrative that the war on drugs put upon us, which is you take the substance and something evil, it will trigger something evil in you, and then you're permanently damaged and you're crazy, or you develop a psychosis, or you're paranoid, right? Psychedelics in the right set and setting are extremely safe. So I show this over and over and over again. They're not risk-free by any means, right? There are a few conditions that people might permanently walk away from, but they're extremely, extremely rare. And when they do occur, they're not super harmful in most cases, right? So in terms of your question with regard to bad trips, the first thing that I want people to understand is that it's all about your mindset, right? And I think that's why it's so powerful, Todd, that you walked into it with this will be a healing experience, because you didn't have the expectations that it will be a blissful or, experience or anything. You said, whatever I get, it's going to be healing. And that's for me what it really comes down to. And I can tell you that my experiences that have been the most challenging have always been the ones that produce the most profound healing. And I think I see that in a lot of people, right? The more difficult in terms of your healing process often means the better, right? So what people can do is, number one, recognize, right, that whatever is happening for you, not against you, and that it's a learning experience. Number two, I think, is there are some ways to prepare yourself in terms of like skill set, right? Because the number one reason why people have bad trips is because the psychedelic brings something up that they don't want to deal. So they try to avoid it. But psychedelics are very stubborn. So they will hammer it
Mhm.
into you until you listen, right? And if you don't listen, like that can be kind of turn into something terrifying. So surrendering and letting go again is the most important skill you can bring into a psychedelic experience. And that's not a skill that's naturally to most of us because most of us love control. And that's something you can practice, right? And just knowing that. And a lot of people say the difference often between a good trip and a bad trip is just a yes, right? And how that translates into how to navigate your trip is if something uncomfortable comes up, instead of turning away from it and trying to think of something else that you'd rather entertain, go towards that thing, right? Go deeper into that most uncomfortable thing that you're feeling right now and just approach it with curiosity and without judgment. Why is this coming up? What is this trying to tell me, right? I love this story from this one researcher who worked a lot with LSD and in the 70s and 80s, in the 60s and 70s. And he tells this one story of a woman who was sitting in his office. He was a psychotherapist and had just taken LSD. And she started freaking out because there was this huge snake appearing next to the chair across from like the guy. And she wanted to run away. Like she was freaked out. And the therapist just said, no, let's stay calm. And I want you to look the snake straight in the eye. And then once she did that, the snake transformed into her mother. And then the therapeutic, session continued. And that
Mhm.
pretty much illustrates what you need to do when things get tricky. Like you have to go deeper inside because it's always coming up in your favor.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But without being educated about that, you could see how people would have that response, and that's where I think your overall message is, getting educated about the process and understanding, those tips that you just gave, for example, which are, again, very valuable because then it's one of those things where instead of labeling it as bad, it's just like you said, challenging.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about psychedelic education because as the research, is exploding, more and more people are going to learn about it. And people are not going to wait for 3 years for mushroom therapy to be legal, right? They're going to
Hmm.
start exploring. You can even go and forage them yourself if you're really like committed, right? And I think it doesn't take a lot to lower your risk of having a terrible experience drastically. Another thing is your breath during the journey, just slowing down your breath and taking long and deep inhales can shift a lot of things. The other thing is the music. The music plays a huge role because, as I said, psychedelics work with the environment that you're in. So if you're listening to like really triggering music, that's going to make things more intense, right? Make a playlist where you have a variety of music, but you also have some like slower meditation music that you can put on in case like things get too hectic. And then, of course, which I didn't say because it's almost like a given for me, the setting is the most important thing, right? Like, don't have your first mushroom experience at a rave with thousands of people without knowing, what kind of dose you can handle, right? Make
Hmm.
sure it's in a really safe and comfortable, small environment setting. Yeah.
So I want to ask you about microdosing because it's all the rage, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, I was actually writing about that this week.
Okay.
So I have a lot of thoughts on microdosing. Well, I agree. It seems to me almost like microdosing is becoming more popular than the traditional psychedelic trip, right? It's on its way to become a mainstream wellness practice, which I think is not bad necessarily, but I want people to understand what microdosing can do and what it can't do, right? Can it give you the same benefits as a psychedelic trip? No. Can it give you benefits? Yes. And I had my own microdosing experiment, which to me proved a lot of the benefits that, by the way, are still not scientifically proven in a placebo controlled study, as opposed to psychedelic trip journeys, where we have lots of research at this point. So it's still a question whether it really works or whether it's just a really strong placebo effect because these people that are taking the microdoses want the microdoses to work, right? But when I had my experience, it definitely helped me with all the things that it promised. I had a better mood. I was more creative. I felt more connected to everything. I had more energy, etc. But after a while, I realized this is not too different from the antidepressants that I'm so against taking, right? And I think that's what I want people to understand, that microdosing ultimately is just symptom management, especially if you're taking it for depression or anxiety symptoms, right? Which is okay. There's, as I always say, there's 100% a need for acute symptom management in many cases where it's more important for the person to feel better now than to plan and prepare for some big psychedelic trip, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I want people to really realize that this is another band aid, and it's a better band aid than antidepressants because it is probably more effective, yet to be proven by scientific research, while being definitely less risky, right? We know antidepressants have a lot of side effects if they even work for you, and microdosing seems to work for a lot of people with no side effects. So it's a good option, I think, but it does not do the root cause healing, which is what you will need if you want to live from a place where you don't rely on anything outside of you to feel good. And that's what prompted me to stop microdosing and instead go deeper in, because I didn't like the idea of relying on a microdose for the rest of my life to just feel good. And after doing all this healing, I honestly have to say that now 95% of the times I feel the way I used to when I microdosed without anything, right? And I hope that people understand that. I think it's a good way to start building a connection with mushrooms and to start getting into the topic, and to start educating yourself on it. But I don't think it's like another miracle cure. So I just want people to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, right now, you know, I've you know, was I've worked in the field of mental health for 25 years, and so I've worked very closely with prescribers, and besides a few questions, I mean, there's if somebody has a major depressive disorder, for example, kind of what the prescriber does is let's throw something against the wall and seeing if it sticks. They start with a low dosage, and they say we'll meet in a month, and see if it helps at all. Are you able to tolerate the side effects? That's definitely one of the things that's huge. But essentially, it could really take up to a 6-month process to find just a Band-Aid. Because I do believe that it's symptom management because, in psychiatry, we don't have a cure for anything right now. It's all symptom management. And so, I'm wondering what your thoughts are potentially on, something like, mushrooms being, either an add-on to what people are if they found something that successfully works for them as far as symptom management in microdosing form, or do you think that it's going to be, potentially something that will get rid of these medications?
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason that it's only symptom management is because how we define psychiatric diagnoses. And I want to preface this by saying that I'm not an educated doctor. I'm not a formal doctor or anything, right? I don't have any credentials, but I spent a lot of time educating myself on this. And in my opinion, the problem lies with how we define these mental illnesses, right? On paper, I had depression and bulimia. What I had in reality was childhood and sexual trauma, which, if you just treat, in the DSM-5, all the different indications are bundled by the symptoms that they produce. It doesn't talk about the root cause. And the root cause for depression is not altered brain chemistry, which is something I'm so passionate about. Yes, the brain chemistry is altered, but that's another symptom. That's not the root cause, right? So if you only define, and I'm a consultant by trade, so I know that you have to first define the problem correctly to find the right solution. So I think as long as, we have this DSM-5 with all these different, symptom masking diagnoses, that's going to be challenging. I think psychedelics will help us learn a lot more about many of these clinical indications that we don't truly seem to understand, right? There's even research that shows that these diagnoses are not helpful because they overlap so much, right? Mm-hmm. And I do see a world in which I think that mushrooms specifically will replace antidepressants over the next 10 years or so. Wow. I really believe that because I wouldn't see why, if you look at psychiatry, there hasn't been any innovation in the last 2 decades, which is crazy. If you look at all the other medicine categories, right? Like all the advancements with cancer, et cetera. And in psychiatry, nothing since Prozac, right? That can't be. So I do think it's going to change pretty quickly. And I think once we start to see the impact of psychedelics on people's mental health at scale, people are going to pretty quickly, jump ship and realize that there's better ways to treat the root causes of mental illness rather than just manage the symptoms.
Mm-hmm. I'd have to give you a little bit of pushback though on one area is that, for somebody who has schizophrenia, for example, or a bipolar disorder, that, that would require an antipsychotic or a mood stabilizer. I think potentially with somebody who in that extreme of the spectrum, as far as the mental illnesses go or groups of symptoms, however you wanted to, I think that could probably be pretty, I don't think it would be effective in my experience.
I'm glad that you bring that up because those are the two conditions where we don't know yet enough about how to use psychedelics to treat them. In fact, because, with schizophrenia specifically, psychedelics have in the past shown to trigger psychotic episodes, even if perhaps someone in your family line had schizophrenia and it hasn't, it hasn't come out in you yet, but it was like dormant. So those are like the two conditions where I always tell people, like, please don't go out experimenting on your own if you have those. Work with a psychiatrist who has a psychedelics informed practice. But you're absolutely right. Like I sometimes, generalize. So I, in my mind, I think mostly about depression and anxiety and addiction, which probably is like 90% of I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I would say it's a large chunk of the issues that people have.
Yes, I mean, that's a fair statement because I think, when it comes to the extremes, I would say that bipolar is probably much more, I don't know, have the stats, right in front of me, but, just in my own clinical experience, bipolar is much more common than schizophrenia. But, we had a person with bipolar disorder on the show, and who used alcohol, for example, to kind of self-medicate. And, as soon as he got on a mood stabilizer, like he was able to manage his symptoms much more effectively. So, yeah, that's kind of, but I hear what you're saying. Most people are, that would come into my practice, for example, would either have depression, anxiety, or some kind of an adjustment disorder, usually like a loss of a loved one, a divorce, things of that, which are very traumatic. But I can definitely see utilizing psychedelics correctly being a huge aid to the mental health profession. Again, I just experienced it myself, and and Tootsie will tell you, like, I'm a pretty, I'm not a hippie at all. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not a drug user. I don't even drink. I'm like super into like exercise, and so
you're a square from Delaware.
I'm a square from Delaware, and so, yeah, I'm very square. And so by doing this, it really went out of my comfort zone. But at the same time, I'm proof in the pudding that it's if someone kind of from my background who's always been, kind of scientific as much as you can be in the social sciences, and kind of gone and lived by the DSM. Although I've always hated diagnosing because I agree with you that there's so many different, even bipolar disorder and BPD can be mixed up a lot. Do you know what I mean? And so I always tried to work with people as far as where they were and working specifically on the symptoms that they exhibited versus caring about a diagnosis. However, it was something that was really important, to be able to get a good grasp on kind of what was going on with their specific situation. But I think, having insight is always going to be helpful. Because then it's one of those things where you can say to yourself, okay, now I know what's coming from, and I can talk about this, and I can get the support I need, and I can get to a better place much quicker. Or, I might have never, and I'm in my own treatment right now, I would have never probably got to that if it wasn't for that medicine. And I really believe that.
And I'm so happy that you're doing this work because you're breaking the stereotype, right? We're showing that you can use psychedelic medicines intentionally for personal healing and growth in a way that benefits yourself and the world around you because you become simply a better person, right? And yeah, I think it's important for people with your background to start opening up those conversations. And I think it's even more important for people to have their own experiences because when it comes to assisting eventually in psychedelic therapy, I would argue that it's almost more important for psychedelic therapists to be really experienced rather than really trained in, traditional psychology rather than, a therapist who's been practicing for 20 years and then they want to offer psychedelic therapy. So they have one or two sessions and that's all they base their new psychedelic practice from, right? Because it's so different. You cannot compare it. It's psychology as, school psychology versus transpersonal psychology, which is a different area of study and
Mm-hmm.
knowledge.
So tell us about your TikTok channel, how you decided to create it, and was it solely to spread this message and reach the most amount of people possible?
Yeah, so initially, the only reason that I created it was to drive more people to my writing. So I started writing about my experience with ayahuasca 2 years ago, and it helped me a lot in my own integration process to make meaning through writing. And I learned that a lot of people are really curious about this because I found that the space really lacks personal narratives. There's a lot about research, right? And all of this stuff, but I didn't find a lot of like really deeply personal stories from people. So I started writing and I have a weekly newsletter that I put a lot of effort into that I write and it goes out every Friday and it's about something related to psychedelic healing from a very personal lens. So I write for a person who's on their own journey or, whether they just learned about psychedelics, they're deep in or they're already integrating, right? And TikTok for me was a vehicle to reach more people because I'd written on Medium and I, amassed a small following there and it was all going well. But then Medium changed the algorithm and I realized like I'm spending so much time writing, but I'm not reaching people. And then I read somewhere that TikTok has more traffic than Google. So I was like, oh, you got to be on TikTok if you want to reach the people.
Uh-huh.
So I went to TikTok and I was very intentional about it in a sense that I like really sat down and I educated myself for like a weekend on like how the algorithm works, like what you should do as a beginner. And I went on the platform and within like 4 weeks, I'd amassed millions of views. And I realized, wow, this platform is such a huge opportunity in terms of organic reach, but also, wow, there's really a need for people to learn about this, right? From someone who can talk about it in a way where I don't leave anything out. And I think that's important, right? Like, do
Mm-hmm.
I want the whole world to know my childhood trauma? It's like, ideally not. But if it gets the word out there, then that be it, right? To me, at this point, my mission is really becoming to make this as accessible as possible to as many people as possible in the safest and most equitable way, right? So TikTok for me is a first step on that mission. My writing is, another step on that mission.
Mm-hmm.
And what has the response been?
Really positive. There are always some haters. Definitely. I think, especially in the beginning when I was walking around saying, like, there are no such thing as a bad trip, right?
Uh-huh.
Comments were like rolling in like crazy. And I think sometimes I get the comment that's the one that I'm still grappling with. Like, don't advertise drugs on a children's platform, right? And first of all, it's no longer just a children's platform. But second of all, it's better. Like, what's wrong about drug education? I'm not saying that anyone should go out and take drugs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think we need to redefine like the terminology because medication is also drugs, right? So what's bad
Sure.
about drugs? Um, but yeah, and in large, I think people really appreciate that I'm clearly like in a position to talk about this because I've spent the last 3 years really educating myself on it. And the people want to know, like they want to know the specifics. They want to know, in terms of risk, that's the biggest question. Like I really want to try it, but I'm so afraid. So I think giving people like very practical things to walk away with is probably where I'm adding the most value currently. But I also want to give people hope because I know when I was struggling with my mental health. And literally everyone told me I was always going to have an eating disorder. I was just always going to struggle with food. And I did not want to accept that. I believed there was a reason and I was going to find it. And I think anyone struggling with an addiction, you feel so hopeless. And I just want people to know that there are root cause treatments and they're coming, right? Like researchers are working on it. All the advocates are out there, right? Campaigning for legalization. So it's coming. I want people to prepare themselves and to start educating themselves on it.
Mm-hmm.
And where can people find you on TikTok?
So I'm Find Jules on TikTok.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you'll find, I have my Substack, which is the platform on which I write, linked on there in the bio. So if you want to follow my writing.
Yeah. And we can link both your TikTok channel and your weekly newsletter in the description box so that people can find you.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Julia. I learned a ton about this, and I will keep that in my little Rolodex for a future day when I might try it. And I'll definitely hit you up if that happens. I just want to ask our viewers if they think Julia has broken any stereotypes about psychedelics and plant medicine. Please drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth interviews that break stereotypes.
Thank you again, Julia.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be with you here today.